Reeves was an investigative journalist working in New York. He had been writing about the paranormal for a long time, making discoveries in abandoned buildings. He had found the perfect place for his latest article, Ashwood Asylum. From the 1940s to the 1970s, this hospital was a place where severe psychological cases were kept. But it was Dr. Victor Halloway's experiments on patients that really made it infamous. According to records, Halloway ruthlessly used mental patients to explore the limits of the human mind. While many patients died during his experiments, the doctor and his team never officially recorded the bodies of the dead patients. In 1974, the hospital was abruptly closed, but no one knew where the remaining patients were taken. Even years later, residents in the neighborhood claimed to hear whispers and screams coming from the hospital at night. Alan had been investigating such stories for years, trying to unravel the mystery behind them. But this story was too frightening even for him. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. He set off for the hospital with a flashlight, a tape recorder, and a small handheld camera. When he arrived in front of the hospital, the huge building rose like a ghost in the darkness. The walls were mossy and some of the windows were broken. The creaking of old shutters could be heard from inside as the wind blew. The main door was closed with rusty chains, but Alan found a boarded-up window on the side. With a few strokes, he loosened the boards and jumped in. Inside the hospital, it was dark and stuffy. The musty smell mingled with the pungent odor of rotting drugs and rusted metal. The corridors were littered with hospital files and overturned stretchers. On the floor were yellowed and grimy pieces of the white scrubs, once worn by doctors and nurses. Alan moved forward, shining his flashlight. Wheelchairs were scattered in random places, and there were deep cracks in the walls. But what really caught his attention were the strange words written on the doors of the rooms. "Do not close your eyes. Run when you hear the sound." Some of the writing was so fresh that it was as if it had just been scratched. Alan spent some time going through the old records. Among the old papers, he found a report in Dr. Halloway's handwriting. Subject 12 says he hears voices. He is here with us. We should not make eye contact. Alan involuntarily flinched when he read these words, but he was determined to continue. The scariest stories about the hospital were about the basement. Rumor had it that Dr. Halloway had conducted his most horrific experiments here. The bodies were not officially recorded, but buried inside the walls. Alan passed the old elevator shaft and found the basement stairs. The old wood creaked as he stepped on the steps. As he descended, the air became even heavier and colder. The basement began with a narrow corridor. A thin trickle of water could be heard through rusty pipes. Old lamps hanging from the ceiling gave a flickering light. Alan was surprised that the electricity was still on. Inside there were old operating tables, rusty surgical instruments, and patient files strewn on the floor. Just then, Alan noticed a door ajar. Moving inside, he saw that the walls were covered in scratches. But the most frightening thing was an old nurse's uniform lying on the bedside table. It was folded neatly on the bed as if someone still lived here. Suddenly, she heard a faint whisper from behind and turned around quickly, but she could see no one. She squinted her eyes. The voice was coming from deep inside the room. When he lifted the flashlight and shone it on the wall, he saw a freshly scratched inscription. "Run when you hear the sound." At that moment, the silence inside the hospital was broken by a scream. As the scream echoed through the basement, Alan's whole body was overcome with fear. His heart pounding, he started walking backwards, trying not to turn in the direction of the sound. But as his steps quickened, the sound of a pair of footsteps coming out of the darkness matched his rhythm. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the basement. When Alan raised his flashlight, A tall man with pale skin and empty eyes stood before him. He was wearing a torn patient gown, and he was walking towards him. Alan ran towards the stairs in fear, but the hospital seemed to have changed shape because the stairs were not where they should be. When he turned back, the shadow was much closer now. Alan quickly raised his handheld camera and took a few frames, but there was only himself on the camera screen. There was only one last way out. Jump out of the window. Alan ran with all his strength to the window and threw himself out. When he landed hard, he hit his head on a hard rock, and his vision blurred. The last thing he heard was a whisper from inside the hospital. "You are with us now." The next day, a group of young people staying at a campsite near Ashwood Hospital reported to the police that they had heard screams coming from the hospital during the night. When the police arrived in the morning, they found no one inside the hospital. But there was a newly added sentence on the basement wall. "Don't leave me here."